All right. Welcome to Theology 121, Introduction to the Christian Bible, summer session starting May 31st and concluding June 26th. So as promised, I have some introductory comments on my kind of conceptual approach and some things to do with format for the course. More to come. So welcome to our introductory course on the Christian Bible. Today, I want to do those two basic things. Explain the concept behind the way I have chosen to introduce the Bible in this context, and go over a few logistical principles essential for our daily procedure throughout the coming 4 weeks of our class meetings. So first of all, my approach. I think this lecture for today will, such as it is, will take about half an hour probably. So my approach, I might start by observing that there are at least 1,000 ways to teach the Bible, and all of them are impossible. I believe that the most common approach is almost certainly to proceed through the Old Testament, then through the New Testament, not strictly chronologically in terms of the complex history recorded in the text, but more or less proceeding linearly through the table of contents, skipping as little or as much as the teacher is inclined and time requires. What is more, curiously, I strongly suspect that this approach, with perhaps slight variations, reigns supreme not only at secular but equally at Christian institutions, and among these at the Catholic schools as much as or more so than at Lutheran, Calvinist, Methodist, Baptist, and evangelical institutions. In the case of the secular, that is, the non-religious institutions, the reasons for this approach are fairly self-evident. In the other cases, there are some good reasons for following the same procedure as well as some bad ones. Be that as it may, we will be taking another tack, another approach, for reasons I will now lay out, one of which may prove to be the elucidation of some of the shortcomings of the more conventional approach I've just identified. I propose what I will dare to call a more realistic approach to the Bible. By no means realistic in the most radical terms one might venture to imagine, but far more realistic than the march through the Bible's TOC, the table of contents delineated above. I want us to attempt an introductory engagement with Scripture in a mode artificially contrived, there goes my realism, to mirror or imitate the way Scripture might have been encountered by the early church, by the first several generations of Christians, and unquestionably by that select Christian subgroup of the early centuries AD, commonly identified as the Church Fathers. To do this really well would require extensive and intensive engagement with not just the biblical texts, but with ancient historiography, Josephus, Pliny, Eusebius, et al., the collective works of the fathers, and ideally of the rabbinic tradition, for early starters, as well as a significant foray into the massive tradition of ecclesial reception, heir to the patristic writings, and spanning the entirety of world history from 33 AD to the present. Though my own theological education has included much more than a mere superficial exposure to these numerous parabiblical fields of inquiry, I do not have the necessary expertise in any of them to conduct competently the sort of course entailed by such a comprehensive outlook, nor do we have the time. So, in addition to my basic imaginative optic, entering into the Bible in a way somewhat like the way the first Christians did, we will stick largely, not quite, but almost wholly, to the primary text of Scripture itself, the books of the Old and New Testaments of the Christian Bible. My justification for this approach, in the simplest terms, is that this is the way the church and Christians who constitute its members still fundamentally engage Scripture today. This description may or may not apply to all or some of you, my students. Be that as it may, such an approach is no less valid or justifiable as a mode of presentation to the non-Christian student, familiar or not with the material in question. Because if this is the mode in which the church has always engaged the Bible, from the church's origins to the present, it is arguably one of, if not the best mode for encounter with it by such an outside audience, insofar as this approach purports to present the material not only in view of its own genuine merits, as the church herself has continuously recognized and honored them across 2 millennia, but as it has been and continues to be received by the Christian church, sympathetically, and as standing at the heart of Christian faith and life. This adds then, in a sense, a second tier to my claim of realism on behalf of my approach. Not only, as I've already asserted, is this the Bible, somewhat as it might have been encountered by the earliest Christians, it is the Bible, I would argue, as it is encountered by the faithful Christian today. This is what we might call a phenomenological assertion, cutting deeper, I take it, than the conscious self-understanding of some readers as readers of the Bible. But to defend that claim would take us much too far afield for present purposes. The skeptical, even the critical listener, may well choose to disagree with such a reading of the Bible as I will tend to present. And I here extend an honest and warm invitation to any so inclined to do so with goodwill and in good faith. But she or he should understand that the Bible never stands in splendid isolation, much less in a vacuum, and that such an influential perspective as the one I aim to elucidate, in however limited a way in the coming weeks, is not easily separated from the text itself, any more than the text can be cleanly extracted from this remarkably tenacious, and to many millions of readers over now more than 20 centuries, profoundly compelling perspective. The approach I've just briefly delineated and defended promises to be both exciting and confusing. Practically, we will be diving in some ways, even more at sea than those who embark immediately from the shores of the front cover of the Bible and move gradually out into the depths. Yet, if my way begins seemingly in the middle of the ocean, as it were, we will have an anchor that should prove to be as fast and firm in the end as the dry land. That anchor, lest there be any doubt or question, is Jesus Christ himself. And so we will begin with the gospel. Specifically, we will begin with the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. This choice would raise the eyebrows of many, as much as the more basic decision to begin with the New Testament. Why not Mark or Matthew? And then we will turn to Genesis. One of the really magnificent fruits of the long, arduous, collective, intellectual, and spiritual work of those fathers of the church previously mentioned was the formulation of what is now typically called in shorthand the fourfold reading of Scripture. According to this approach, championed by John Cassian and St. Augustine, among others, not to mention St. Thomas Aquinas in the High Middle Ages, the words of Scripture always convey a spiritual sense, in addition to, above, below, their obvious surface meaning, usually called the literal or historical sense. What, in short, does the text literally say? That's the historical or literal sense. The spiritual meaning is, in turn, parsed out as 3 further possible meanings: the allegorical or figurative, the tropological or moral, and the anagogical. More on the particular notions intended by the latter terms during our first week of class, and no doubt here and there throughout our course. For now, suffice it to say that following the steps, the vestigia of the fathers, we will move from John to Genesis in quest not only of a rudimentary appreciation of some of the key characters and moments in the rich drama of salvation history, but also in search of connections with, figures, types, anticipations of what we have recently seen in the gospel, anticipations of Christ's life and teaching, passion, death, and resurrection, and of his founding of the church. The early church was made up of Jews, including the apostles themselves, along with an ever-burgeoning number of converts from among the peoples broadly identified as Gentiles. In the simplest and most sweeping terms, non-Jews, pagans of the widest variety of cultural and religious background throughout the Mediterranean, and soon the wider Asian, African, and European world. While these two groups of new Christians would have encountered the Old Testament differently, both were confronted with the urgent imperative of the primacy of the New Testament, the gospel, as the point of constant departure and return, as the lens through which all else was now to be evaluated, then confirmed, qualified, or rejected outright. And so, like them, we shall begin with a quick but still thorough immersion in the textual waters of Jesus. Leap backward, or is it really, to the Jewish stories of the beginning, the creation of the world and the earliest history, or is some of it a kind of prehistory of God's self-revelation to and calling out of his chosen people, the Hebrews who become the people of Israel? And then, having waded, we hope, a bit more than ankle deep into this truly extraordinary tradition, we shall leap forward again to the New Testament and into another gospel. How many gospels can there be? Matthew this time. Matthew will lead us in some ways both surprisingly and yet almost naturally back to the book and the events of the Exodus, where we will now discover the remarkable figure of Moses, doing his own thing, or God's thing, while simultaneously recalling our recently past experience of Matthew's account of Jesus, the Messiah. Idea? The rest of the syllabus proceeds according to the same fundamental assumption. A continuous resonance is to be observed, heard, reverberating and echoing back and forth between the two testaments, from the beginnings of the Gospels and the Pentateuch, also called the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as of the Hebrew Scriptures, to the last of the minor prophets and the concluding lines of the book of Revelation, the final text found in the New Testament in both Catholic and Protestant canonical lists. I said this way of working our way through the Bible is liable to be both exciting and confusing. Big things are often both, if not merely daunting, even terrifying, or prejudicially but secretly suspected to be so overwhelming that one succumbs to the seductive sentiment, lazy and rather pitiful, if not despicable, as convenient and ultimately transparently self-serving. The sentiment that the Bible is actually pretty boring. And lest you think I cast aspersions merely at the sadly typical college student of the early 21st century, St. Augustine was guilty by his own admission of precisely this gross misapprehension of Scripture in his youth, around the age of 19, in fact. I hope instead that you will take up and embrace the challenge and plunge in, discovering the excitement, the thrill of the strange, the beautiful, the awesome and awe-inspiring, the supernatural on every page we read. As for confusing, the Bible is huge, and the story it seeks to tell is even greater and more complex than the sum total of all its many, many words. Any attempt to learn something significant about the Bible over the course of a single semester, much less such a course crammed into a few sparse weeks, is bound to be bewildering. My way can hardly hope to escape this feeling entirely, and will not seek to. Indeed, if it were somehow to convince you of the simplicity and clarity of the content of this multifaceted work, I could only deem that to be evidence of egregious failure on my part. Still, I think there is hope for an experiential outcome not limited to that aspect of confusion. The Bible is exciting and beautiful. And, as Augustine later came to understand, so rich and profound that the wisest and most intelligent of men and women might spend lifetimes exploring and never exhausting its depths. What then do I envisage for this course? My hope, in brief, is that you will be drawn imaginatively into this text at one or several of many dimensions: the literal historical, the literary narrative, the theological, the human psychological, the philosophical, the metaphysical, the spiritual. So let's dive in. The second part of what I want to say something about today in an introductory mode is procedure or logistics. So for the rest of this initial explanatory lecture, I want to say a bit about the concrete logistics of the course. First of all, the course is, as you know, online, synchronous, as we have so quickly learned to say over the past half decade or so. This does predate COVID, much as our memories might fail going back more than just the last 2 to 3 years. There are both advantages and disadvantages to this mode of course delivery, as we've also learned to say. The biggest and most obvious disadvantage is, obviously, the fact that we are not in each other's real personal presence. This should not go unremarked and cannot be understated. So there it is. To counter this disadvantage, we need some fairly rigorous parameters for our professional academic engagement, professional from your side as much as from mine. At the top of the list of these parameters is the fact that I expect you to have a physical Bible, not merely an online e-version, in front of you, open to what we are discussing throughout the 12 upcoming meetings. This is non-negotiable. No excuses about cost of a single book or any other ludicrous confabulation will I accept. If you don't have the required book already, get it immediately. Have the order rushed. If it's not here by our first day of class, you will need to obtain a library copy of the same edition for any class meetings for which you do not yet have your own copy in hand. You may, of course, opt to use a library copy of the same edition throughout the course. However, I encourage you to have your own version, so you can bend the pages and write in it if you so choose. This great book is one not to be set on a mantelpiece or under glass in a museum, but to be used and, dare I say it, maybe one day even loved. One of the great things about an introductory Bible course, at least about this one, is that the Bible is practically the only text you will need. There will be no more than a very few assignments from any other source, the first of which I have already given you for our first day of class. See my first email to the class. Second, in addition to our required 12 class meetings on Zoom, we will be heavily dependent on both the D2L Brightspace aspect of the course and on YouTube, and possibly other online sources for other assignments, including occasional lectures from me. In addition to the syllabus, which we will need to consult regularly, daily, throughout the course, and which will be available no later than in time for our first class meeting, you should also check daily for any updates from me via email, including links to lectures or other online materials, suggestions, and comments from me about how things are going and adjustments we may need to make, etc. Each class meeting after the first will be associated with a substantial reading assignment from some part of the Bible. The lion's share of our first hour each day will be devoted to an in-depth but fairly fluid discussion of that reading. Then, during more or less the middle hour of most and possibly all of our meetings, I will direct you to some provocation relevant to our day's work. A short film or episode from a television or internet series, a musical or artistic work, a short written text. Our third hour, I should say a short non-biblical written text. Our third hour will then be devoted to a second in-depth discussion of the provocation itself, but also again of our assigned text from the Bible and of our readings for the course thus far, especially in light of the things we have just read or seen or heard in this intervening provocation. The biggest use of bright space will be for your writing of 2 brief reflections each class meeting, except for the first and last, where there will be just 1 each. One at the beginning, the other at the end of the day's work together. This will be detailed in the syllabus when it comes out. I will be providing more detailed guidelines and requirements for these reflections in the next few days, including the syllabus, and some separate handouts incorporating guidelines and requirements. So stay tuned. For now, note that these are each worth 1 point for your overall grade and are close to but not quite pass-fail exercises. You will need to indicate that you have been making a real effort to engage the biblical text and other sources with some real attention to detail. On the other hand, you will not, cannot reasonably be expected to have achieved a thorough command of the whole of our reading assignments. There is just too much. The rest of the course grade will be determined by 3 elements: an hour-long midterm in-class writing assignment, a short final paper, and your ongoing oral contributions in our discussions throughout the course. In light of this general description of the grade breakdown for the course, the syllabus will include the precise percentages associated with each element. One final comment is in order, I believe, concerning my hopes and expectations of you as students in this course. In my long experience of teaching, I typically include class participation as an important but relatively small portion of the overall grade for my courses. Essentially, this is because there is a good deal of objective content in a typical theology course, and any student ought to be expected to demonstrate having achieved a reasonable degree of mastery of that content, however rudimentary. While this is, in principle, no different for a course entirely dedicated to introducing the Bible, I feel strongly that the intensive form of this course, coupled with the material in question, warrants a much heavier emphasis on comparably intensive, active student engagement, inevitably at the quantitative cost of the portion of a grade determined by more straightforwardly objective measurement. Consequently, your grade will depend ultimately, in very large part, though not exclusively, as I have already noted, on your sustained contributions in class from beginning to end of our month-long conversation. I am genuinely prepared to give everyone A's in this course. I mean it. On the other hand, I will have no scruples or twinges of conscience about giving out B's, C's, and even D's and F's. If the evidence you provide indicates that such grades most accurately describe your overall intellectual and practical engagement of the material for the course. All this is effectively to say that your effort really does matter in this course more than in many others I have taught. But be advised that the mere insistence that I am trying hard or did try hard is in no way a self-validating argument. Over the course of somewhere in the vicinity of 20 hours of conversation together, there will be ample evidence for such a seasoned professor as myself to gauge rather precisely both the quantity and the quality of your effort. In view of the unpleasant but inescapable fact that a course with such content as this must also result in a grade, the formidable task before me over the next 4.5 weeks might be put this way: to render a reasonably accurate objective assessment of your work for the course, while simultaneously offering to you and beginning to open for and with you this book as a gift. A gift, as they say these days, that keeps on giving. If only you will open your eyes and ears, the eyes and ears of your imagination, the eyes of your mind, the eyes and ears of your heart to what is here. You can't objectively summarize the worth of a gift, of course, as either recipient or giver. The gift will either be received or not on its own terms. But who, in truth, is the real giver of this would-be gift? That is a question to think about seriously over the next several weeks. Consider, for the sake of argument, that your professor in this endeavor is merely a messenger or even just a delivery man handing on a package. Open it up. Open it. Open it. It has no breakable or perishable contents. It contains only some old stuff. Old stuff mysteriously pregnant, potent beyond imagining, waiting for you, capable in all its ancientry of making all things new, waiting to change your life.